This is the debate on the socialist calculation debate. Socialist calculation debate raged in England in the 1930s and earlier in Germany in the 1920s. And it was resurrected by Austrian economists who debated the meaning of the debate itself during the 1990s. Okay, and it actually continues today, though I think the two sides have grown closer. I have the infamy of having sort of started the second debate, okay, the debate on the debate. Though before my article had appeared in 1990, there was an article by Israel Kirzner in the late 80s on the socialist calculation debate, pointing out that Austrians could learn quite a bit still from that debate, despite the fact that it had taken place 50 years earlier. And so in part, mine was a response to his article, though his article wasn't really controversial. First, let's talk about what the calculation debate was all about. And then I'll give you my take on it, which is not the take of others, but we've become, I think, closer, as I'll show you. Basically, the debate was started by Ludwig von Mises, okay, in the 1920s. In his famous article, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, okay, which was published in 1920, and then was incorporated into a book that he wrote on socialism in 1922. Basically, Mises' achievement in this article, I think this is one of the greatest articles of the 20th century, by the way, was to destroy the intellectual foundations of the case for social central planning. But secondly, it was really a revolutionary breakthrough in economic theory, demonstrating the nature and necessity of the price system. And here I do agree with Israel Kirzner. And thirdly, it was really the completion of the Hungarian Revolution. What Mises did in this article was to show how subjective values were transformed into objective prices which could be used as meaningful cardinal numbers in economic calculation. So it was a step in the direction of the completion of the Hungarian debate, which was fully completed, as I said, with his human action, in which he gave us a complete theory of monetary calculation. In 1920, he only gave us those parts of monetary calculation, or the theory of monetary calculation, that were necessary to show the impossibility of socialist central planning. The word impossibility now has to be carefully parsed. When Mises said that socialist calculation was impossible, or he sometimes says that socialist economy is impossible, he did not mean that you couldn't have a group of people owning all the factors of production and producing something. Okay? What he meant was that they would not be able to determine if they were producing the optimum pattern of output, even from their own point of view. Okay? That is, he was saying that they could not economically allocate resources to the highest valued uses, even if they themselves determined the scale of values for society. Okay. The reason is, without a price system, you could never find the costs of these various goods that were in which you had output. All right. Now, so Mises' thesis was as follows. He said that the rational allocation of resources was impossible without monetary calculation. Okay, and the reason why, the reason why this was so was because without a price system, there would be no way of determining how much the production of any particular good cost, and without knowing the costs of various goods, you could never determine the most profitable line of production. And he pointed out that there were three preconditions, institutional preconditions, okay, real-world preconditions for economic calculation. The first, he said, was private property in all orders of goods. Okay, both consumer goods had to be privately owned and traded, as well as capital goods and natural resources. Secondly, there had to be a freedom to exchange. Okay, if there was a system that existed in which people were allowed to own property but could not exchange it, and that system has existed in history at times, where, for example, in the Middle Ages, land couldn't be alienated from the families that owned it. It could only be passed on. Without that freedom to exchange, or rather, the freedom to exchange was the second necessary, was a second prerequisite, let's say, of economic calculation. And third, there had to be sound money, okay, because all prices in the real-world market economy are money prices, okay. Now, what he points out is that socialism really abolishes all three. It abolishes private property in all orders of goods because the capital goods are owned by the state. And it abolishes the freedom to exchange because the state, being the monopolist of these goods, cannot trade with itself. So, since there is no exchange possible in capital goods, there can be no price of these goods. And without prices of these goods, there's no way to determine costs of production. Right? Let me give you a simple example of this. Mises never denied that the central planners could know their, what we might call their technical production function. Okay, let me make sure I do this right. Okay. Chad, I'm getting a shadow. Hit the lights. Okay, so I'll make sure I do everything. Okay, good. Okay. This is a production function for an automobile, okay? Not being very technically oriented, I don't really know how many tons of steel are in an automobile, maybe 2 or something. But anyway, let's assume that these the central planners know through their their teams of engineers and so on exactly how many tons of steel, P tons of steel, are required for production of an automobile, plus a certain number of hours, Q number of hours of machine time, plus a certain number of hours of unskilled labor and of engineering labor, plus a certain number of square feet of factory space and kilowatt hours, certain number of kilowatt hours of electricity, and V hours of managerial labor. They know if you combine all of those things, according to a technological recipe, which they also know, that you'll get one automobile. Okay. The key is it worth producing that automobile? Given that all of those things are non-specific inputs, meaning that they can be used to produce many other goods in an industrialized economy. Okay. Are you using those goods in the most valuable manner from their own point of view? And the answer, of course, is no, because the units in which these goods are specified are heterogeneous. There's no way to add up kilowatts, kilowatt hours, with square feet of factory space, with hours of machine time, okay, with tons of steel, and come up with one unitary cost figure. There's no way to do that. Okay. So that was Mises' main objection. Now, we know that there are certain other problems arise once there are no objective prices for these things. For example, should the production, would it be better to produce these automobiles with, let's say, more capital-intensive methods? So, instead of just Q hours of machine time, would it be better to have Q plus A hours of machine time? In other words, why not have more machines operating, maybe in the case of turning the factory into run mainly by robots, okay, with 1 or 2 people just manning the computers that control the robots, okay, and reducing the amount of labor. So reducing the amount of unskilled labor to R minus B, okay? So they can't know, even if they decided somehow that this was the best use, or that they wanted another automobile, they don't know the cheapest way of producing that automobile. Should they produce it in a more capital-intensive fashion or less capital-intensive fashion? Okay. Also, let's assume now that they're producing a run of automobiles, and that this factory that they have can be allocated to producing 20,000 automobiles, or the factors could produce 150,000 motorcycles or 500 houses. Okay. once again, without knowing costs, without knowing, because each of these things would take different proportions of these factors, of these inputs, they would not be able to determine what the output should be. Okay. Again, remember, take the U.S. economy, okay, and hold that in your mind. Imagine all the different uses of steel. There's a certain amount of steel in the economy, and there's only one optimal pattern for using that steel. Okay? Now, entrepreneurs operating under a market economy can easily figure out the best use of the whole stock of steel. There's a certain demand, as we'll see, based on their forecast of future prices, and they, based on those forecasts, bid for the steel, and let's say the steel is $300 a ton. Then every use of steel that is expected to increase revenue in the different industries in the economy by at least $300 will absorb some of the steel. Okay? Anyone who has a prospective use of steel that has a marginal revenue product in addition to total revenue that is less than $300 will not get any of the steel. Okay? Supply and demand, the market will clear, we'll have a supply and demand, an equilibrium price, and equilibrium quantity that's exactly equal to the available stock of steel. Okay. How does the economy solve this problem of determining whether, the market economy, determining whether or not we should produce this automobile? Well, under a market economy, where the three preconditions of economic calculation are fulfilled, where there is private ownership in the means of production, every single unit of every single input, of the hundreds of thousands of different inputs and types of labor and so on, maybe millions, has a market price. Every single one. So that any conceivable and technically feasible production project or production process can be, the cost of that process can be determined. Okay? So let's say that this is the decision about producing a Ford Taurus, and the total cost, or which is the sum of all of the prices of the inputs, is $18,000, including the interest return on the investment of capital. And the price of the automobile itself, let's say, is $21,000. Okay? Now, that's not the current price, that's the expected price. Current price might be less. Okay? But next year, at the end of this process of assembling this Taurus, entrepreneurs, as we'll see, may expect that the price would go from $17,000, it could shoot up to $21,000. Right? So it's the future price that is important. In any case, then that is telling them that they are taking resources that have a lower value in all other uses in the economy, at least a lower prospective value, and they are redistributing this entrepreneur to a more highly valued use from the point of view of consumers. Okay? On the other hand, should the cost exceed the expected price, should the cost be maybe $22,000 per car for this bundle of resources that is needed to produce a car, then the loss would indicate that it's not rational to produce that good, because you're misallocating resources. You're taking resources that could produce goods worth about $22,000 on the market to consumers, and using them to produce a good that's worth only $21,000. Okay. Now, is that to say entrepreneurs using economic calculation are infallible? Well, of course not. Okay. In the first quarter of this year, GM lost $2 billion. They're laying off 25,000 workers. That doesn't mean that economic calculation doesn't work. What that means is that in the past, they've overestimated the demand for their products. And therefore, they anticipated a higher selling price. But at least they know that they're making mistakes. And at least they know that they have to restrict production of these automobiles, which they are in fact doing. Okay, they're laying off, as I said, I've seen different 25,000 or 28,000 in the next few years, and they're going to reduce their total capacity for producing vehicles from 6 million, I read, to 5 million. Okay, so it tells you when you're doing something wrong. Now, my opponents in the debate, Israel Kirzner, Pete Betke, Steve Horowitz, would say something like, well, you know, they would agree with me, and they said that, one of the things that this tells us is that this market economy is an error correction process, or it's a corrective process. No, it's not a corrective process, okay? Because it doesn't mean that things can't change, that there's not continual changing going on, so that they can't simply follow the past losses and say, aha, once and for all, we need fewer cars, and that's what we're going to do. In fact, things could turn around in 90 days, you know, or things could turn around in 2 quarters. They have to forecast that this trend will continue into the future in order to make that decision to cut the number of automobiles. If they believe that things would, let's say gasoline prices would dramatically drop, okay, if they have some information that indicates that gasoline prices will dramatically drop, let's say, in 6 months, and that the demand for automobiles will skyrocket, particularly the models of their firm, then they wouldn't blindly cut back, you know, just simply follow prices and say, hey, we're losing money, we lost $2 billion in the first quarter, we're going to lay off workers. In fact, they might actually expand. Okay? So, it is not a corrective process, it's a selective process, meaning it selects those entrepreneurs that are continually making the right decisions in a world of uncertainty and change. Let me mention something else that Mises makes clear, that there is a difference between what we call economic calculation and valuation. Mises never denied that an individual or a small family, let's say living in isolation, what we call in economics a household economy, couldn't figure out the costs of production, okay, without money. Money's only needed in a complex industrial economy in which you have heterogeneous capital goods which can be used in different uses, okay? Where all capital goods only had one use. If every resource only had one use, there would be no problem of monetary calculation. If it couldn't be used anywhere else and it could be only used to produce cars, then all the resources that could be used to produce cars would produce cars, because they can't be used anywhere else. They have no opportunity costs, in other words. But what Mises says is that in a household economy, people can figure out opportunity costs. So let's take the famous Robinson Crusoe. His value scale. Why do you mean to do that? That's his value scale for allocating, let's say, 12 hours of labor a day. Let's say he sleeps 12 hours a day. Okay. And he's going to do it in 4-hour units. Okay. And let's say that's his value scale, that he prefers 4 coconuts, highest on his value scale, then 2 fish, 3 pounds of mushrooms, 1 sack of berries. But he only has 12 hours, and each of those alternatives absorbs 3 hours. The question then becomes, what's the cost of producing 1 sack of berries? Let's say it's 4th on his list. Well, he could easily see, since it's only, you know, the natural resources aren't really scarce, it's really his labor that's the scarce good here. His labor in this situation has a cost of the expected utility of 3 pounds of mushrooms, okay? He will only engage in production processes which have a higher value than the utility of 3 pounds of mushrooms. So what if he suddenly finds that there's rabbits, or rabbit, I don't know if that's a plural, but he finds that there are rabbits on the island, okay? And he says to himself, now wait a minute, now can I afford to hunt that rabbit? Okay? In order to hunt that rabbit, I don't want to give up anything that's more valuable that I could produce with those 4 hours right now. So it's a matter of his value scale. The current cost of labor is the expected utility from 3 pounds of mushrooms. If he expects that rabbit will satisfy him more than the mushrooms, then what will he do? The benefit from the rabbit is higher than the cost. The cost being always the least most valuable use of the resource that is currently undertaken. So what he will do then is to devote the resources to hunting the rabbit. If the benefit from the rabbit is lower than the cost, then he will not. So Mises says that yes, you can run if you want to call it a socialist economy, within a small household, or an individual can, okay? You can run it without calculation, but you cannot run it in a system in which you have a multitude of heterogeneous goods, capital goods, inputs, which have multiple which are non-specific, which could be used in many different, but not all, production processes. Okay. Now, I think some people who've been at the Mises University have heard the story. I have a friend in Montana who used to live in New Jersey, and I grew up with her. And in any case, she actually married a real cowboy, believe it or not, from Montana. They live on a ranch. And one day she called me up, and we were talking, and she says, I've got a new house. And I said, well, so you moved off the ranch? She says, no. She says, we had the house shipped in. So I said, what? She said, well, here in Montana, since labor is so scarce in Montana and therefore has a much higher value, herding cattle, which they actually do, they have cattle drives and everything. It's very scarce and expensive. They don't build the houses on site. In fact, her house was built in Nebraska, and these huge trucks haul the modular pieces of the house to the area where they're going to be built, and they put them together. So it's very capital intensive. It uses a lot of capital because capital is relatively cheaper than labor. Whereas in the Northeast, of course, where labor isn't scarce, no one in their right mind would ever think of buying a house somewhere else and then having it shipped to where it's going to be, the residence. Now, could a socialist planner ever figure this out? That you should build houses, hundreds of miles away, and then have them shipped? Okay, without economic calculation, it's very unlikely. I mean, they might figure it out, but it's extremely unlikely. Okay. Okay. All right, let me just mention a few conclusions that we get from Mises' analysis. Okay, he tells us that a socialist economy is literally impossible because it cannot calculate the opportunity costs of production and investment decisions, which I've just shown you. Okay. Even the term socialist planning or socialist economy is an oxymoron. Now, why is it an oxymoron? It's an oxymoron because not only do socialist planners make mistakes, but they can never know if they're making mistakes. They're in a desert without a compass, and they might want to get to a particular point, but they don't even know which direction to go in. Okay? So, in the same sense that Robinson Crusoe rationally allocates his resources, his labor, to the most highly valued consumer goods, okay, the market economy, with cardinal prices generated, okay, through entrepreneurial bidding and entrepreneurial forecasts, can in effect allocate goods to their highest valued uses from the point of view of consumers. So the market economy operates rationally in the same sense that Robinson Crusoe operates rationally. The Soviet Union does not, or the former Soviet Union, or any other centrally planned economy, cannot do that. So in that sense, they don't economize. There is no such thing as a socialist economy. It's an oxymoron, an inconsistent use of words. Okay? The reason being that they don't know how to allocate all these different resources with multiple uses among the most valuable uses, even if they themselves are going to determine as dictators the most valuable uses. Okay? They can never know the trade-offs. Okay? Because think about it, in our economy today, resources, okay, let's take the U.S. economy, the available stock of capital goods, which approaches millions and millions and millions of units of capital goods, can be reallocated an infinite number of ways. Okay? There's an infinitude of different economies that we could create out of existing resources. In other words, there's an infinite number of different patterns of outputs that could be produced today. How do we figure out the right one? Well, we never know there is a way of forecasting the right one, and that is through market prices and economic calculation. Okay. What happened in the Soviet Union was that they used a system called gross output planning. Okay, and there was the planning central planning board was GOST plan, and basically what they did was that they would specify quantitative targets for output. Okay, now it's very difficult to specify the exact quality of the types of output that you're giving the various firms, socialist firms, the targets for. Okay, so basically they motivated the managers by giving them bonuses for meeting or exceeding the targets, okay, and they got a trip to the gulag for not meeting the targets consistently, okay. But what's interesting then, it turned into a system of mutual lying, of course. Okay? You want a bonus, but on the other hand, if you exceed your target one year and get a big bonus, what happens next year? They raise the target. They say, aha, this factory can has greater capacity. So the manager will always lie and say that target's way too high. He'll try to get it down, and he'll make sure he maybe exceeds it a little bit, but not by much. And on the other hand, they know the commissars of each industry know that he's lying, and so they'll raise it. So the information is completely distorted. The incentive is that information is not accurate. One of the one of the jokes that was often made about the Soviet Union. Well, one was when it was actually a cartoon, and I can draw it here. And what it was there was a huge nail, okay, and the nail is on a long train. Okay, so you have a train here. It's carrying the nail to wherever it's supposed to go, and it's 100-ton nail or something like that. And then there's the commissar. He's got that big furry hat on. Yeah, I like that. And then there's the plant manager, and he's saying, well, comrade, he says, I've met my output target for this year, okay, which was, let's say, 100,000 tons of nails. He would always make the nails in the easiest possible way that permits him to meet his target, okay. So this is, that's an exaggeration, but the truth is that many houses and structures in the Soviet Union were unfinished, even though they couldn't be used because they didn't have roofs or roofs. And the reason why they didn't have roofs is because the small roofing nails that you need weren't being produced because they were more costly to produce. So you were in danger of not meeting your target. Okay, you had to use more resources to make the smaller ones and the larger ones. And there's stories about smaller sizes of women's clothing not being available. Everybody walking around in these huge clothes and so on. Okay, because you make things as large as possible. Now, on the other hand, if they specify a number, then you make a lot of small nails, and the large nails will disappear. The one story that was told was about Khrushchev, who during a speech to the Politburo, berated of all industries the chandelier producers because they were making these huge, heavy chandeliers that were crashing down and killing some of the comrades in their dashas, in their vacation homes. Seriously. There was kind of like people saying, what is he talking about? Westerners didn't know what was going on here. They're pulling ceilings down. And of course, the big joke, the joke that went around, in the 1970s was that, Khrushchev in the 50s had banged his shoe on the podium at the United Nations, and he said, we will bury you, meaning economically, we will bury you. And so the Soviet economists told their Western counterparts, we'll bury all of you except for Hong Kong because we need to know prices. So we'll allow one small island where there are prices, And it was true that the Soviet Union was using world prices, at least for electricity and things that they traded in, okay, and for steel and so on. But they weren't. Those prices were still inefficient because they didn't exactly reflect their local conditions. Okay. Now, what about the very existence of the Soviet Union? People later on said, well, Mises is obviously wrong. Here it is, it's the 1930s, and the Soviet Union hasn't collapsed yet. Well, Mises' impossibility thesis was not undermined. He pointed out, in his first article, he said, real-world socialist economies, such as the USSR, which was already in existence by 1920, he said, are not inconsistent with my thesis. He says, because they exist in a world of capitalist prices. He said, it's just like the post office. The post office, as inefficient as it is here in the United States, can exist and can go on in a fashion by using the prices that are generated around it. Okay? But Lenin, on the other hand, said that he wanted to turn the whole economy into a post office. If you turn the whole world into a post office, then you have the problem of economic calculation. Now, that's not to say that using world prices that don't reflect scarcities in your area or in your economy will allow you to be very, very productive. And the Soviet Union wasn't very productive, okay, despite CIA statistics, and then Paul Samuelson and Galbraith, along with the CIA, who claimed that the Soviet Union was catching us and that eventually there would be a convergence and their rate of growth would eventually surpass us, and they'd be eventually a bigger absolute economy than us. And also other nonsense, okay? And also in the Soviet Union, there were black markets, and there was a system of bribes between socialist enterprises. If there was trade, even though it wasn't supposed to be. If someone had an excess of nails and needed copper wiring, they would trade. And there were brokers who would buy and sell, who'd broker the deals. And so these were a system of bribes called Blat, B-L-A-T. Also, there was other black markets, the purchase of Beatle albums and jeans and so on in the Soviet Union, and because it brought in hard currency, there was the Soviet authorities looked the other way. Okay, was there a true period of socialist economic planning? Yes, there was. War communism. Socialism really existed from about 1917 to 1921 during the period of the counter-revolution in Russia, the fight, the war between the whites and the reds. Okay, there was also another group called the Greens. They don't get much play, but they were an anarchist group that were fighting both the royalists, the czarists, and the communists. Okay. In any case, everything started to break down. Lenin said, "We are abolishing money. We're abolishing all accounting in money prices." And we're going to, just have accounting in natural units. How could you have that? Natural units, as I showed, tons of steel, kilowatts, hours of electricity. They're heterogeneous. You can't add them up. You can't get a single figure for costs. In any case, what happened was that you had houses. The whole system began to break down. Okay, very little was produced. People began breaking up their furniture and then their houses for firewood. People moved from the cities. The cities were emptying out by 1921. They were going into the countryside and leading a nomadic existence. That's what socialism leads to, a complete breakdown of the social division of labor. Okay, universal brigandage. Okay, that just foraging and stealing, and these small household groups or small bands fighting with one another for resources. So yeah, socialism can exist after a fashion, but it's impossible to run the social division of labor at a high level without economic calculation. Okay. And by the way, Lenin then reversed himself and instituted the new economic policy. By the way, the same name that Nixon took for his policy of wage and price controls. Okay, but at least Lenin was moving in the right direction. He allowed some exchange and so on. Okay. Now let me just talk a little bit about the intellectual division of labor, and what I think is one of my contributions here. I mean, it's really in Mises, but I think I brought it out a little bit more. And this is the social appraisement process. How is it that we actually go about transforming subjective values for goods and entrepreneurs' qualitative knowledge about consumer values and their expectations about what market conditions will be in the future? How is all of that information and knowledge translated into objective cardinal numbers that can be used meaningfully in economic calculation? So I call this a social appraisement process. Mises uses the word appraisement in two different senses. And here's what we have. You have the entrepreneur, and let me use this. You have the entrepreneur at the center here. Okay, now, the entrepreneur wants to earn pure profit. He wants to buy resources at a price that is lower than the expected output. And here's what we have. You have the entrepreneur, and let me use this. You have the entrepreneur at the center here. Okay, now, the entrepreneur wants to earn pure profit. He wants to buy resources at a price that is lower than the expected output prices of whatever production process he is engaged in. Okay. So what the entrepreneur starts off as doing is the following. Okay. He has experience of what present prices are. Okay. Now, the prices that exist right at this moment have now become past prices. Okay. So the price that was just paid for a bottle of wine, over at Kroger's just now, is now, we might call it a present price, but it's a past price. And entrepreneurs have experience of immediately past prices, which means it's called present prices. And they have experience of present market conditions. Okay? They have experience of what goods consumers are demanding, or that are in heavy demand by consumers, and what goods aren't being demanded. That is, they have experience of profits and losses that are currently occurring. Okay. Now, that has no direct relevance. Okay, and here's where I think Mises and Hayek differ. Has no direct relevance, present prices and profits and losses, to what decisions entrepreneurs are going to make in producing today. Why? Because production today is always for a future market. Okay? To produce an American car used to take, from the drawing board to the dealer's showroom, 7 years. So when you decide to begin to build equipment and invest in producing a line of automobiles, all right, that's 7 years before the fact. You're not interested in what the price of an automobile is today. You're interested in it as a starting point. Okay? And then what you have to do is to forecast, okay, and Mises used the word understanding, based on your experience, you apply your understanding or forecast of how consumer tastes, resources, and technology will change over the course of the production period. All right. But that's still qualitative. We still don't have prices. Well, given that you're starting from a present price, you can say, all right, I think demand's going to go up for these automobiles so that in 7 years they're not going to be worth $18,000. They'll be worth $22,000. So even if this particular automobile or type of automobile is losing money today, you may very well decide to go on with production of it. So in that sense, present prices are not a guide to actions that are oriented towards the future. Okay, and here's, I think, where one of the biggest sticking points in the debate, the current debate over the debate. Okay. Now, based on their appraisements, okay. Now, what appraisement means to put a cardinal number, a price, based on qualitative information on a good. So individual entrepreneurs all begin to appraise the prices of the goods that they're going to produce in the future. So, for example, it could be a good that doesn't even exist. Stephen, I don't know if is it Jobs or Jobs, I don't know how to pronounce it, the founder of Apple. Okay, he's sitting in his garage, or so the story goes. IBM has developed, late 70s, early 80s, the technology for a PC. President of IBM at the time appraises the future very wrongly, says that PCs will only be household toys to play games on. They'll never have a widespread use in the business world. So I think his name is Watson at the time, goes on with production decisions to continue to produce huge mainframe computers. Stephen Jobs appraises prices of personal computers differently. He believes that, in fact, they will be used in business. Okay, there'll be more than just gadgets for kids to play video games on, or whatever, and he goes on with the production. Now, based on all of that, the entrepreneurs, based on their conflicting or competing visions of what future prices of different consumer goods will be, go to the resource market, and they bid prices for those resources. And in bidding based on their expectations of future prices of consumer goods, it's at that point that we get a whole structure of resource prices. And that is social appraisement. Okay? No one mind determines what those resource prices will be. It's the hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs bidding on the basis of their individual visions of what future market conditions will be, of what future prices will be, who determine, given the supplies of the various resources and the decisions made by resource owners, that bidding determines the prices of resources. So now, every single resource right now, every ton of steel, any input into any process, has a price. And so it allows the entrepreneurs, okay, bidding against one another to determine if their production project is profitable, okay, or expected to be profitable, or if it is not. So the existing resources go to the most highly valued uses as anticipated by entrepreneurs. They don't know for sure, it's anticipated. And this changes not just from year to year, but from day to day. There's continual change, continual revision of decisions. Right? So, unlike Hayek and Kerzner, who claim that present prices give us knowledge, no, present prices don't give us any knowledge. In fact, you have to know. There's this famous tin example by Hayek. He says, look, no one has to know the conditions in the tin market. Let's say that there's a strike in Bolivia, and it's impending. In a month or two, unions are threatening to go on strike. Supply of tin is going to decrease. Prices are going to go up, and therefore, builders here in the United States are going to have to, or users of tin here in the United States are going to have to substitute other materials such as plastic and copper and so on. Okay. Well, according to Hayek, when that occurs, prices change, and the user of tin here in the United States automatically then substitutes something cheaper, plastic. The demand for plastic goes up. Price of plastic goes up. Well, the users of plastic don't have to know why that happens. They have to economize. So they produce fewer skateboards, let's say, because they're made of plastic. Or they substitute other composite materials for plastic. And then so that the demand for something else goes up. And this ripples through the economy. And isn't this nice, the way all this knowledge is spread through the economy simply by prices? People don't have to know anything else. Well, if you're an entrepreneur and you forecast market conditions, you have qualitative knowledge, you're a user of tin, and you say, hey, you know what? Tin is going to go up in price. You read the trade journals. You have an idea that there's going to be some sort of you or speculators do, that there's going to be some kind of disruption of the tin supply. You jump in as an entrepreneur or a speculator. You buy up the tin now and you sell it later. Or if you're a producer, you immediately start buying plastic, okay, at a lower price today, because you know you're going to have to shift to it, okay, rather than use the tin. So, and you earn profits. So even in Hayek's tin example, there is a mistake, I believe, that you have, that somehow present prices are all that is needed. Now, Roger Garrison has disagreed with me and said, well, you know, prices are guides, they're not marching orders. Hayek says that somewhere, and Hayek does say that. But if you read Hayek's works very closely, he keeps lapsing back into this terminology that somehow prices, since he points out that in the market economy, prices do their job because they're always very close to equilibrium, okay? Which according to Mises, of course, they're not. It's, in fact, the prices that are relevant for today don't even exist yet, and the resource prices, they're no guides, because resource prices themselves are determined by prices that people expect to emerge in the future of consumer goods, okay? So it's expectations of the future that determine prices of present prices of resources, okay, which are relevant to entrepreneurial decisions. But the point is, entrepreneurs have to have a lot of other information besides prices to make their forecasts of the future. So present prices depend on information. It's not the other way around. It's not that you don't need information or knowledge because present prices give them to you, but rather it's that you need the knowledge and so on as an entrepreneur to forecast the future in order to make reasonable bids for resources. Okay. So now, as I'll show you in a moment, that the state of the debate has become, in fact, maybe I'll do that now. There's been a closing of the gap. Steve Horowitz, in an article in the History of Political Economy, has made some significant admissions, though I don't want to say that he agrees with me on everything. He said a few, the following. First of all, his article called Monetary Calculation of Mises, he says there are two important implications of this argument. First, given that later participants in the calculation debate, including Hayek, downplayed Mises' emphasis on monetary calculation and ignored its relationship with the use and functions of money and monetary institutions, a re-emphasis of the monetary roots of the Mises critique enables us to view the calculation debate through a fresh lens. Meaning Mises always focused on money prices. That's another reason why the general equilibrium criticisms of von Mises later on didn't hold water. I'll talk about the socialist criticisms in a few minutes, but it didn't hold water because Mises wasn't talking about general equilibrium. You don't have money prices in general equilibrium. You have only barter prices. A few other things that Horowitz said. He says, Mises' elaboration of this point centered around the use of money prices. Okay, and again, Hayek doesn't stress money prices like Mises does. But now Steve is doing that. A couple of other statements he makes. He says, as accurate as these arguments were, and these are the arguments from The Use of Knowledge in Society, one of Hayek's most famous articles, and his other very famous article, Economics and Knowledge. So he says, as accurate as these arguments were, and as much as they were crucial to the recent revival of Austrian economics, they largely neglected the original monetary themes that pervaded Mises' 1920 article. Okay. And he also says it was through the process of actual exchanges against money that competing entrepreneurs endowed prices with their own appraisals of existing and expected market conditions. So the prices aren't something that are automatically there telling entrepreneurs what to do. It's the entrepreneurs themselves through what I call the social appraisement process. Okay. By the way, Mises says that the problem of socialism isn't a problem of knowledge. He says it's a problem of one will acting. Okay, very, very stark statement. What does that mean? It's a problem of one will acting. What it means is, if you, instead of the entrepreneur there, if you have one monopolist who owns all the factors of production, if he owns all of those things, then there's no bidding process. Then there's no way of generating prices. Okay? So, where there's one will, and Murray Rothbard, by the way, expanded that to say you couldn't have one big cartel in a market economy that owns everything for the same reason. It would immediately break down. It would become chaotic. It would lose money, and it would produce the wrong things, and it would break down because it's the same problem as socialism. So one last point that is made by Steve Horowitz. He says, monetary calculation is intricately linked with Mises' conception of the entrepreneur. Okay? Salerno has rightly called attention to Mises' very important discussion of valuation and appraisement. What entrepreneurship is for Mises is the formulation of an expectation of the future constellation of prices, okay, as I've shown here, and the attempt to see opportunities within that vision that others do not currently notice. So, Steve Jobs sees something that others did not notice, that in fact, PCs will be widely demanded in the future by businesses, and he was correct. Okay, IBM, on the other hand, loses $13 billion in 1990, 1991 because of the decisions they make in the early 1980s and continuing to produce mainframes. So the largest loss in industrial history. Okay. I think GM's loss of $2 billion the last quarter is something like the third largest loss or something like that, because they have made mistakes. Okay. So this is what Mises calls the intellectual division of labor. It has nothing to do with the dispersion of knowledge. Hayek talks about the division of knowledge. Mises talks about the intellectual division of labor. What does that mean? It means this, that every one of us are involved in the social appraisal process. As consumers bidding for consumer goods against existing stocks, which gives consumer prices to the entrepreneurs, and as owners of labor and other resources who are reacting to bids by the entrepreneurs, and then of course the entrepreneurs themselves. Every human being in a market society is involved in the social appraisement process. Okay. And that's what Mises means by the intellectual division of labor. I stress that point because others have claimed, well, he's talking about the division of knowledge. And he really is not. Okay. Okay, we have a few more minutes. I'll talk a little bit about what the socialist response to Mises was, what Mises' response to the socialists were, or responses to the socialists were, and what Hayek's later responses to the socialists were. What Mises, when he first wrote the article, okay, it was written in German, and it was German socialist, German Marxists basically that tried to respond to him. The dumbest response came from Otto Neurath, who was in bohm-bawerk's seminar, interestingly enough, with Mises and with Schumpeter and with other famous economists. And he said, "What's the problem? Like, what is Mises talking about?" He says, "Under socialism, we'll abolish money and we'll have what he called in natura calculation. That is, we'll have accounting in kind." Okay. Of course, this just dismisses the whole idea that you can't add apples and oranges, which we all learn in first grade. That the heterogeneity of goods, when you have the heterogeneity of goods, there is no common denominator, okay, to add up these units of goods. Okay, you can't add up, as I said, tons of steel, labor, and so on. So Mises had already disposed of that criticism in the original article. Secondly, other Marxists said, well, we'll have calculation in terms of labor hours. Labor is homogeneous. We'll just add up the number of labor hours it takes to produce goods. Okay? And that will tell us our costs. So then we'll at least know the relative costs of different things, and then the planners can make their decisions based on their own value scales. Well, first of all, of course, labor itself is heterogeneous, Mises said, and of different quality. Just for example, watch the NBA championship game tonight, okay, between the Spurs and the Pistons. You'll see they're all basketball players. They're all working for the same amount of time, but their skills are tremendously different. Okay, so even in the same industry, labor is not homogeneous. Okay, let alone between industries. Okay, how do you compare an hour of labor of the ditch digger to an hour of labor of the brain surgeon, and so on? Okay, so he immediately, he had already responded to that. Secondly, that answer leaves out of account the fact that you have to take into account or account for the value of capital goods. Okay, obviously, we have more capital goods producing a good. The hours of labor that you need are going to be lower. So you're not going to get a true accounting of costs when you leave out of account capital goods, okay, which are heterogeneous and which you can't add up in terms of hours of labor. So capital goods are scarce; they must be economized. Third answer was a little bit more, I wouldn't say sophisticated, but a little more clever. The socialist said, wait a minute, you claim capitalism works well, that under capitalism there's a tendency to produce the correct goods that are demanded by consumers and to use the correct technical methods. What we'll do is we'll allow simply, we'll tell managers, just we'll keep the same managers. Keep doing what you're doing. Right? Just keep producing the same goods, use the same methods. Okay, we don't need accounting, we don't need prices. Well, of course, what's wrong with that? The market economy is dynamic. There's a continuous change in technology, in consumer demand, in resources. Some resources are becoming completely depleted, where new sources of resources are being opened up. So, to make a long story short, that only applies, that argument, to a static or stationary economy where there is no change. Okay? And in general equilibrium, in a static economy, no one would need to know prices. Okay? Keep doing the same things over and over again. That's what Mises called the evenly rotating economy. Produce the same things every year. Okay? There's no need to change because there is no exogenous change. No one changes their preferences. Technology remains static, and so on. Okay? It's precisely in a dynamic economy where every minute things are changing, and you want to make sure that there's a way of continually reshuffling resources so that you're producing the most highly valued and not producing something that has a lower value than something that you're not producing. It's only in that situation where economic calculation is important. Okay. So that was Mises' responses to the more naive Marxist replies to his original article. All right, now, in the 1930s, then, this socialist debate breaks out in Great Britain and the United States. And there's a number of neoclassically trained economists, okay, in the neoclassical sense, very good economists, that respond to Mises. Okay, Oscar Lange, who eventually went back to Poland and became an apparatchik in Poland, but who was trained at the University of Chicago. Abel Lerner, who was trained at the London School of Economics. Some of their responses went as follows. One response was, well, we'll just use a system of simultaneous equations which embody the data, the consumer value scales, production functions, and resource availabilities. Okay? And when we solve this system of equations, we will get the equilibrium prices and equilibrium quantities, okay, including the equilibrium input and output combinations. So as long as we have all the data that are needed to insert into our equations, we will get the optimal pattern of output and the optimal prices. But in fact, Barone and Pareto, two general equilibrium theorists, Barone was Pareto's student, who wrote before Mises, pointed out that even a very small economy would take thousands and thousands and thousands of equations, which could not be solved. This is the era before computers. All right, but that's not Mises' critique. A second socialist response to Mises is the trial and error method. This is the Lange-Lerner solution. Also, an American economist named Fred M. Taylor advanced this sort of a solution. Here you tell the Central Planning Board directs the managers and firms of industries to follow some very simple rules. They say, one, make sure input and output decisions are based on prices. And we, the Central Planning Board, are going to set these prices. Okay? So you simply take the prices as, they use the word parametric. Okay? They're parameters. Okay? So you don't question these prices, these consumer goods prices and these input prices. You simply take them as parametric, and then in each firm you minimize the average cost of producing any particular good. You don't try to maximize profit, you simply minimize cost. And in the industry, you tell the commissar of the industry that he is to allocate output, okay, produced, up to the point where the last unit of output produced has a marginal cost equal to price. Okay, so you allocate the output among the various industries or various firms in your industry so that price equals marginal cost, which they claim is what happens in perfect competition, as does the minimization of long-run average cost. Finally, prices in all consumer goods markets and all producer goods markets would be set by the Central Planning Board using trial and error. That's what's called a trial and error method. What does that mean? That means that if they set a price of steel, let's say $400, and at that price there's a surplus of steel, then what they're going to do in the next period is lower the price until the surplus is wiped out. Okay? And they'll find the equilibrium price in that fashion. They'll find the right price. And eventually, competitive equilibrium will be established. Right? So this would ensure that the prices and quantities of competitive equilibrium emerge in a socialist economy. And in fact, they point out it will be superior to the real market economy because, like Knight and others, they believe that the real market economy is full of monopoly. Okay? So we won't have monopoly because we'll have these producers setting their prices equal to low and average cost and make sure that price on the industry level is equal to marginal cost. All right. Now, Hayek and Robbins were the first to answer this. They answered this with these criticisms with articles written in the 1930s. And basically, they focused on the dispersion of knowledge in the economy. So in response to the mathematical solution, Hayek said, well, socialism is possible in some sense, but it's highly impractical. Okay? He admitted, being a student of Wieser, that theoretically, if you had all the data, you could solve the calculation problem. Okay? But practically it's impossible because, first of all, The economic data are widely scattered, okay, and they're subjective in nature. So it'll be very difficult to get the data to those people that are going to insert them into the equations and solve for the equilibrium quantities and prices. And secondly, as Hayek pointed out, even if the data were collected, okay, the system of equations would be much too large to solve in this era before computers, okay? And finally, Hayek points out, even if the system of equations could be solved once, okay, the data are continually changing. We live in a changing world. So in a dynamic economy, you would have to repeatedly collect new data and resolve the equations. So it would not permit a very good solution of the economic calculation problem. Secondly, in response to the trial and error method, okay, which came to be called market socialism. And by the way, these 1930 responses, especially this trial and error method, is conceding Mises' point. Okay, the fact that you do need prices, whether they're generated, mathematically or they're generated by some sort of what we call a competitive solution of market socialism, you need prices. So they were already agreeing that you have to have economic calculation. So what Hayek's critique is pretty insightful of the market socialism and the trial and error method. He says, all right, again, there's a dispersion of knowledge throughout society, which is one of many problems facing the central planning board. And this would lead to great inefficiency for the following reasons. Number one, the central planning board could not change prices as rapidly as the market. How long would it take them to change the price of steel? The market can change the price of steel, from moment to moment. Commodities markets change the prices of commodities, from second to second. Okay, but it would take time to change all prices from the center. So you could change prices, but they would be always, on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, whatever it would be. It would be much slower than it would be in the market economy. Secondly, Hayek pointed out, since you couldn't get all the local information to the central planning board, the price changes would not embody all the information that they do under a market economy, where the entrepreneur knows the local conditions and can change them immediately. Okay. So basically, Hayek's argument stressed a lack of means of communication for knowledge. Okay, and it concluded that socialism was very, very inefficient, and but not impossible. Right? All right, socialism would calculate a day late, okay, or a month late, or 2 months late, but there would be some sort of calculation. Now, what about the critique of Mises? Mises said even if the director knew all the information, okay, so he immediately puts aside Hayek's problem. He says, let's assume they know all the information. Though he doesn't deny that Hayek's right in saying that they wouldn't, but let's assume they do. He said he would still not be able to use mathematical equations to find the competitive equilibrium, okay, the competitive prices and quantities. Because, think about it, today's capital, today's machinery and factories and so on are not the right ones. They embody all errors that have been made by entrepreneurs in forecasting the future. So they have to be continually changed. Okay? So these are not true data. You have to continually change, even if you knew the future was going to be certain, okay, it wasn't going to change for another 3 or 4 years, whatever it was, you still have to change the capital stock over time from day to day. As certain machines wear out, you have to change them and adapt them to new technology that has developed in the past. As Mises points out, for example, would we have built the railroads, which have lost money since the World War I? Would we have built the railroads as they were built if they knew that the airline industry was going to develop? No. So you have to, as railroads wear out, you don't replace them with the same thing, which is what a general equilibrium solution would do. Okay? You don't replace them with the same thing. You need new and different and better capital goods. And you can the only way to do this, the only way to know how to change your inputs and make new inputs, different inputs, is through profits and losses, everyday profits and losses. And an equilibrium mathematical solution, there are no profits and losses. Everybody gets their marginal revenue product. Everything is completely adjusted. There are no profits, there are no losses. So you could not ever reach the equilibrium state. And the second point that Mises makes is, let's assume you know everything about the equilibrium state. Not what exists today, but you know exactly what capital should look like. You know exactly which goods, how many airplanes you should have, how many railroads you should have in the future, where they should go, how many highways should be built, where laborers, housing patterns, how that should be changed, or where they will be in the future. Let's say you know that 10 years down the line, everything should be this way. So you know the equilibrium. Mises points out, but in that case, you're now here with a disequilibrium stock of everything. How do you change it in a way that uses the goods that exist today in their best uses? He says, without profits and losses, once again, you can't do it. And since you don't have a market, he says, you don't have profits and losses. Okay? So you'll never get to that equilibrium. And Mises points out, that's just assuming that you know all this stuff. In a real market economy where things are changing every day, the equilibrium that you're aiming at changes every moment. There's a new equilibrium that the market economy is aiming at. Right? Rothbard uses the metaphor of a rabbit chasing in a dog race. The dogs chase a mechanical rabbit. Okay, they never catch it. But so the equilibrium position is changing moment to moment. So even if you knew it, you still need profits and losses. It's changing. So you always want to make the best possible use of your resources today, and you need profits and losses. And an equilibrium solution never gives you profits and losses. It doesn't tell you today you have too much of this and too little of that. All right. Finally, now the Mises' critique of competitive socialism, or of market socialism and the trial and error method, is completely different from Hayek's. He says that the distinctive mark of socialism is the oneness and indivisibility of the will directing all production activities. Now, keep that in mind. No matter how you try to play market, Mises says all they're doing is like children playing a game. They're trying to play market. Okay? Let's say you have all of these different, you've given the rules to the managers of the firms and the heads of the industries, and you tell them to go about minimizing costs and producing up to the point where marginal cost is equal to price. He says this completely misconceives the nature of capitalism. Capitalism isn't a static managerial system, right? Capitalism is an entrepreneurial system. Okay? How are they going to know when they should shut down their plants? When they should build different plants? That's the whole point of capitalism. So Mises says they're just playing market. Capitalism is not a managerial system, it's an entrepreneurial system. For example, as I pointed out, GM is now cutting back its capacity by 18%. It's firing 25,000 workers, closing down plants. Okay? There's no, with these rules given by the trial and error method, there is no way of doing that. So Mises points out that the key is the capital markets, that you're going to have investors trying who will shift their funds out of industries that are losing into industries in which there are prospective profits. Okay, so to use Schumpeter's term, capitalism is a process of creative destruction. You have to have profits and losses, which you're not given by any sort of equilibrium method, to know which industries to destroy, which jobs to destroy, and which new industries to put in their place. Okay, and which new jobs to create in their place. Okay. As he points out, he says that under capitalism, the managers don't make the final decisions. They're completely constrained by the stock market, the credit markets, and the commodities markets. Okay. But he points out these are what are absent under socialism. These markets, which control the flow of capital in a dynamic system. But, Mises goes on to say, but the response to Mises was, well, you know what, we'll have a socialist investment bank. And we'll have these funds that will be bid for by the socialist managers or the industry heads, whatever. And they'll bid for it according to an interest rate, and we will then loan the money out. But Mises says this is just playing a child's game. Because you still have what? One mind setting up the rules under which these people can bid. So it's a game. It's not real markets where you have real trade in various shares of stocks and in bonds and so on. And very interestingly, Rothbard points out that he once asked Mises, having in mind, for example, Sweden. People used to argue in the 60s, is Sweden a socialist economy? And if it is, it's operating very well. So Rothbard said, when can you say an economy is a socialist economy? And Mises said, when it no longer has a stock market. Okay, so you can even have individual, like the Nazis did, allow individuals to continue to own their firms. But if there's no stock market, if the state is the investor, then there's a single will operating on the economy. And then there's not true prices in the economy. Okay. So let me sum up with Mises versus the Hayekians. According to Mises, calculation is a praxeological problem, okay, facing Crusoe and that faces Crusoe and I'm sorry, it does not face Crusoe because he can have direct valuations, but it faces people acting under the social division of labor. Okay, he also says that socialism is a problem of means and not of ends, meaning that it's a problem of how to allocate goods to ends. Okay? Ends can be taken as data. Right? Whether they're the ends that the dictator or central planner tries to determine from consumer valuations, or they're the dictator's own ends. Now, Kerzner, for example, claims that, and Hayek would too, one of the problems with socialism is that they can't get the dispersed knowledge of subjective ends from everyone. Well, Mises puts that problem aside. He says, that doesn't matter. Let's just use the dictator's own ends. Okay? One example I give when I teach my undergraduates is let's say you have, there's a Star Trek episode in which there's a woman on a planet and she's an empath, they call her. And anyone around her, she feels their needs and their reactions and their expectations. So let's say this dictator's an empath. So he can absorb everybody's value scales. Okay? And according to his own feelings of intensity of these needs, he can rank them. Even in that case, Mises points out, though he wasn't a Star Trek fan. Okay? He liked Lost in Space. But even in that case, Mises points out they still couldn't calculate because there is no social appraisement process. Okay, he still couldn't figure out in a world in which you have a multitude of multiple use resources, you still can't figure out prices. You can't trade with yourself and generate prices. Okay. Capitalism has solved the problem of economic calculation using money prices. That's extremely important. The entrepreneur is at the center of this system of capitalism. He is the appraiser of future prices, and it's his bids for inputs that brings about a cost system for all inputs. Okay, and in order to make those bids for resources, he must have prior knowledge. He must have qualitative knowledge. Prices don't give him any knowledge except what prices are today. And that helps him determine, given his qualitative knowledge, how prices will change in the future. And he uses those future prices to determine his bids against other entrepreneurs for the inputs, which brings about the resource prices that gives you the basis for costs. Okay. And finally, as I said, past prices are not any kind of a direct guide to your production decisions today, as Hayek sometimes when speaking loosely says. But in fact, they are really only a starting point, okay, part of the experience of the entrepreneur that is necessary to figure out what future consumer prices will be. Okay. And I will stop there and take any questions. Yeah, Dan? I don't want the George Mason line on this. Go ahead.
Recognizing that Kerzner was addressing Schumpeter
yeah.
in his presentation of discovery process of
right.
entrepreneurship over calculation process of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
And he was trying to address that Schumpeter's conception of general equilibrium was incorrect.
Yes, that's true.
Entrepreneurship was
Yeah.
disruptive to equilibrium.
Right.
But otherwise, we were characterized by equilibrium. Well, then I'm not sure if the placement of dismissing the role of knowledge and discovery in entrepreneurship in the context of socialist calculation debate is well focused, because Kerzner wasn't necessarily talking about that issue, but rather talking about a similar issue of discrediting general equilibrium.
Let me just say one thing here, because I don't want to be misinterpreted, and it's actually partly my own fault, because when I wrote my first article on this, there was so much focus on knowledge and not on monetary calculation that I may have overstated the case, believe it or not. But later on, I developed this notion of the social appraisement process, or at least I fleshed out Mises's, something that was implicit in Mises. I've told Pete this, and we've had arguments about this. I point out that there is an important role for knowledge, but it's knowledge that individual entrepreneurs must absorb themselves, okay, from their experience of present market conditions, which will allow them then to formulate their understanding of future market conditions, that is, their forecasts. So what I'm saying is that prices don't give you this knowledge. Prices don't give you the knowledge of what to do. Prices that you see today do not give you the knowledge of what to do when you're oriented in producing towards the future. Okay? So I didn't make that in the original article. I maybe didn't make that as clear as I should have done. So
So would you still consent that aspect of knowledge is lacking from Hayek's presentation of knowledge?
I think this whole focus on I don't think Hayek focuses enough. I think Steve even admits this in Economics and Knowledge and Use of Knowledge in Society. He doesn't focus enough on monetary calculation. Okay. Now, Steve and Pete, who also has come to agree with me about the appraisement process and the centrality of the entrepreneur and of money prices and all of that, they still go on to say, well, prices are imperfect substitutes for knowledge of the future, or for knowledge that you need for production. They lapse back into conflating future prices and present prices. They're not, okay? Prices do not give you knowledge of the future. Prices give you knowledge of what happened in the past. Okay? If you see a price, it's either going to be a price that returns to the entrepreneur a profit or a loss. So it means that he made a mistake or he was correct in the past. Okay? The only reason why that price is good or is useful is because it's a starting point by which you can say, well, if demand goes up and supply changes, these things will happen to price. But to know if demand or supply are going to change in the future, that's where your experience of the market and your forecast of the future of consumer demand and so on, like Stephen Jobs and so on, that's where that comes in. Right? So that's where I still think there's a gap between Pete and Steve, the Hayek view and what I take to be the Mises view. Okay? Yeah. Any questions? Yes? Yeah, Bob.
Yeah. First of all, I totally agree with you that there's a difference between Mises and Hayek's arguments against socialism, but that's not what this point that Dan's touched on, I'm not so sure why you guys, by which I mean people on the side of this, why you spend so much time hammering this particular issue.
Right.
Just for an analogy, I'm working with the best way to get my question.
Yeah, sure.
So somebody says, hey, the printing press is great because it allows the communication of knowledge with written word.
Yeah.
And I said, no, that's crazy. I can go buy a cookbook, but the cookbook alone doesn't help me make a cake because if my oven's not plugged in, turn the dial 350.
Right.
It's really the individual baker who has to know everything. So the claim that books transmit knowledge is crazy. So for that sort of thing, clearly what the person would say, well, no, the argument's not that books are contain all you need to know, but they help you to go on and make the cake. So is that what the quibble is over?
No, I don't think so. What I think is this, and at some point at the end of his discussion in Human Action, Mises says, talks about monetary calculation, and he says, and this is, and besides this fundamental criticism, there's a criticism brought forth by Hayek and Robbins about the fabulous number of equations you would need. So then in the article in which he does criticize Hayek, which was only in French, which published in '38, and then we translated it and had it published in the Quarterly Journal. There he says his critique is different from Hayek and is the fundamental critique. So I would agree that, see, Roy Cordato, a long time ago when I wrote this article, I think may have said what you were saying, and maybe I'm wrong. And what he said was, well, aren't exchange ratios knowledge? You know, that is prices, aren't they knowledge? Well, yeah. I mean, I agree, sure. You know, anything that we learn, I mean, you know, that is new is knowledge. Okay. The question, and maybe that isn't exactly what you said, but anyway, the reason why we hammer on this point, as you say, and we do, and we're hammering a little more lightly now because I think people are, you know, we're coming together in some sense. But the reason we hammer on this point is because social calculation is a fundamental criticism. So even if you had all the knowledge, which you can have, and Hayek's right, and things are dispersed, and there is, you know, entrepreneurs do discover new things and so on. All of that's correct. But even if you had all the knowledge, you could not calculate economically. So it's a question of what's fundamental and what's something that's additional to it.
Yeah, if I could just restate.
No, you restate it because I don't think I got it. Yeah.
But that confuses me even more because, in other words, I was taking you guys to be spending a lot of time trying to argue prices do not really convey knowledge.
Right.
But so what if they do? You can see that because as you're saying, it's not a knowledge problem, it's a calculation.
Right.
So I
Right.
don't see why you guys spend so much time trying to convince people
Okay.
prices don't
All right.
convey knowledge.
All right.
That's not really.
All right. Let me put it another way. Prices, for example, Stephen Kinsella has written some good things on the web on this, but prices that we see, any prices that that are realized prices, okay, which means prices that are in the past, only convey, to the extent they do convey knowledge, they convey knowledge about past decisions, okay. Prices, future forecast prices are based on our knowledge of past conditions. In other words, we have to have the knowledge before we can forecast these prices. And then when we bid for the resources, those prices are well, I guess you could say they convey knowledge of, okay, fine. They convey knowledge of what, of how far any particular entrepreneur should go in buying the services of those resources. But then that becomes almost trivial. Right? I mean, that's just another, I mean, we're talking about calculation in a different way. Hayek didn't mean knowledge in that sense. I guess that's Hayek meant knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place. That somehow, you know, the local entrepreneur knows those things, but he needs some idea of what's going on in the rest of the economy, and so present prices give him that. So they take knowledge to the decentralized producer who knows local things and allows him to make reasonable decisions. And Hayek does say that to the extent that the economy works, it's because prices are very near their equilibrium levels. There are a number of quotes, and I've gone over this, and Steve and Pete refuse to answer me on that basis. Okay, so that might clarify matters a little bit. Any other questions? Yeah.
This process of the experience of present prices
Right.
and the forecast of consumer taste.
Right.
I mean, this is logical induction. Has anyone done anything with this concept in the work of David Hume?
Not that I know, but I'd like to see something like that. That sounds. When you say logical induction, what do you actually mean? This I never heard. Yeah.
In the past,
Yeah.
And although we don't know for sure what's going to
Right.
happen in the future, we make a good guess. Or
Right.
Attempt
Right.
to determine what's going to happen.
Right. So that's called.
It's
Yeah.
not absolute. I mean,
Oh, I see. It's not a. Right.
It's not empirical. per
Right.
se.
Right.
We make a good guess.
Right. So there can be better or worse guesses. There's a criterion in Hume for better or worse guess. Well, I mean, that's very interesting. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but I like to see somebody. I think there has to be more work on this. I don't think this is the final word by any means. There's been a number of papers. I gave you just the basics, but there's been a number of papers. There's a paper in the QJAE, our journal, by Odd Stalbrink, who attempts to sort of reconcile my view and Rothbard's view and Jeff Herberner's view with Kerzner and Pete Betke. So you might want to look at that. I don't completely agree with it, but I'm the editor of the journal. I think it is a contribution, and I'm happy to have it there. So if anybody has different takes on it, that's good. I'd be happy to entertain it. Okay, one or two more questions? Yes, go ahead.
If I've understood you correctly, it seems like the nature of the basic approach to economic theory is crucial in regards to this question, and Mises takes the praxeological approach, and Hayek takes the general equilibrium approach.
Right.
And that you have to approach the critique of socialism differently if you're working in one of those two paradigms. So
I think that's true.
my question would be then, if we say we want to take some of Hayek, what we might consider Hayek's insights,
Right.
and bring them into a praxeological paradigm, how might we do that? What would be his role, in other words, from the praxeological viewpoint?
Right,
what would
right.
be his role in what Hayek's written?
Well, I think there has to be some work there, because I think there are some subtle critiques by Hayek of the trial and error process, for example. I mean, there is nothing wrong with pointing out that knowledge is dispersed and that, in fact, it would take, and it's not in the form that can be easily communicated. I mean, those types of things are important additional critiques of socialism, but they're not the basic critique. Okay, I haven't thought much about what you're saying, but I think there is scope there to develop that further. David Gordon has, in a review of something, I don't remember exactly where, he wrote that, well, just because Mises is correct doesn't mean Hayek's not correct. It simply means that Mises is more fundamental. Oh, one thing I did want to say is that I don't think Hayek did try to break away from general equilibrium that he had learned from Wieser in his 1937 article and 45 article. But the way he did so was not to make things more dynamic, but to simply say, well, knowledge isn't given. It isn't in one place. So if it was, we would have general equilibrium. Okay, whereas Mises would deny that. He says, but it's not. So we need the price system to more or less allow us to allocate resources, and he uses this, he says, as one mind would if it had all the information. And that's a direct contradiction of what Mises would say. Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused, but let's just slightly tie up the confusion.
Sure.
You said there's a debate about the debate.
Yeah, the debate, yeah.
And what you're talking about is the debate of the debate.
Yeah.
Is the debate over, or is that still being debated? The original debate?
No, it went, actually, I should have mentioned that because that's a very good question. Really briefly, everyone thought that Mises and Hayek lost the debate. All neoclassical economists, I should say, okay, and the intelligentsia. They thought, well, you can have, look at the Soviet Union and the Lerner and Lange won the debate because the neoclassical paradigm is one in which general equilibrium plays a central role, and what they said accorded with general equilibrium. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, that even a socialist like Robert Heilbronner came out in, I don't know if it was a New Yorker or admitted that Mises was right. So in the post-World War II period, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, until the day there began to be a fall in these collectivized economies, it was thought that the debate had ended in the 1930s and that the Austrians had been the losers. In fact, Oskar Lange sarcastically said, we ought to erect a statue in the Ministry of the Economy to Ludwig von Mises in Poland, because he did bring up a problem that did affect socialism, that of economic calculation, but we solved it. So he brought up a problem. So Lerner and Lange solved the problem. What was interesting, when Lange went back to Poland to become an economic commissar, he didn't use any mathematical solution. He didn't use any trial and error method. Okay, he says we don't need a computer. He said that the way we operate is akin to that of a computer. Okay, but anyway, I'll end there. Okay, but the debate over the debate is still going on. Thank you.